Hello, Jerry Beal here, and this audio is entitled Working with Your Senses of Self on Purpose. We don't have a relationship with ourself, but we do have a relationship with our senses of self, at least on here in time-space, we do. I know this because it's evident for me that we're once removed from anything and everything in the material world through our own beliefs and interpretations about anything and everything in the material world, including our own material bodies, of which is the most significant aspect we self-identify with. For we also self-identify with our behavior and many other aspects about our body life, and we do that unconsciously. Therefore, and at least for time-space, our self-conscious awareness is attached to our senses of self without us knowing that until we awaken or become basically enlightened in ways you're hearing about here and now. So, we don't gain and maintain our senses of self in any random way. We don't choose our senses of self in any random way. Rather, we gain and maintain our senses of self by what we're believing. Now get this, by what we're believing others are believing about us. Not what they're believing about us, but what we believe they're believing about us. And that came from Charles Cooley. This includes our own versions of God, our sense of God. For being raised Mormon, it has been my sad experience to miscreate God in the image of a very judgmental God. And people can only relate to what they themselves create or miscreate. Thus, shortly after my body went into puberty, I created God judging me pretty harshly when it came to the sexual urges the Mormon leaders tell their young unmarried people to ignore so they won't act out sexually, including masturbation, which is apparently both wrong and sinful. Therefore, the more the sexual urges came up in my mind, the more bad, wrong, and unworthy I felt, which means I was empowering a sense of self like this, at least one sense of self like this. I am ... I am bad, wrong, and unworthy in a sexual way, and so it used to be. So this sense of self idea was very much alive in my mind, where our mind's job is to give us the experience of our own beliefs and our own self-beliefs. And because, and then I'm going to be quoting from A Course in Miracles here, and because every decision you make stems from what you think you are and represents the value you put upon yourself, and because what you think you are can be very hateful, and what, like a sex offender, and what this strange image makes you do can be very destructive. That comes from A Course in Miracles. One more line, and I'm not going to tell you about that right now. And because of that, I was unpurposefully miscreating a sort of bull in a china closet around being sexual when I wasn't supposed to be sexual. And so I was empowering that bad guy in me more and more and more, which ended up in the long run ruining my life, at least as most people think about sex offenders. So if you have the label sex offender, if me or anybody else has the label sex offender, nobody gives a shit what else you may have accomplished or what else you may be other than a sex offender. We look for and find in others what we don't like within ourselves, and so a sex offender is so handy for everybody to say, oh, look at that terrible person. Don't look at me. Don't look at the way I offend sexually, but the way that guy does. Look over there, not at me, Then, if I hadn't have become basically enlightened through my struggles with trying in vain to stop the terrible sexual urges I tried so hard to resist, I could blame the very judgmental Mormon God and the Mormon Church for ruining my life. I'm saying I could blame the Church if I hadn't become enlightened I received a gift that is far better than even the worst thing that could happen on planet Earth in 3 dimensions, and that's to become basically enlightened. But instead, I pulled back the curtain. I'm saying I could have ruined my life, and I did. As most people think of it, I did ruin my life through that kind of thing. But instead, I pulled back, and so instead of going along with that, I've pulled back the curtain that hides my Wizard of Oz, meaning my own spooky versions of a very judgmental Mormon God. And so when I realized these things, I began to recreate God in the image of a loving Father, just anxious for his son or daughter to awaken to their own reality. Notice the story Jesus told about the prodigal son. For when the son returned to his father's home, all broken and exhausted from his apparent sins and misadventures away from his father's home, he asked if he could be a servant. But his father said, "Hogwash. It doesn't matter what you've done or what you've been or where you've been. It only matters that you return to your real home and with your father. For you are my child, no matter what arrangements of the conditions and events that you thought made you unworthy to be my child." Thus, for us to be on purpose in our lives and for us to have our own free mind, because it's guilt that ruins our. The guilt is the biggest assaulter on our own personal freedom there is. Guilt is totally insane and has no reason. Thus, for you to be on purpose for us to be on purpose in our lives and for us to have our own free mind, we ought to use a sense of self that seems to come up and in between we as the good guy and we as the bad guy, as though shoving both of those aside. And by the way, we miscreate the good guy and the bad guy in us because we so stupidly took on what Adam and Eve took on, which required them and us to go around judging this, that, and the other, including our own senses of self, in the polarizing categories of good and evil, right and wrong, moralistically. Therefore, and to be on purpose in our lives, we take on the sense of self. I am perfectly okay just the way I was, am, and will be. And that sense of self is the truth. In the same reasonable way the prodigal son was accepted by his father, no matter the conditions. And that sense of self serves us well more than any other sense of self does. I am perfectly okay just the way I was, am, and will be. And by the way, that's how you parent your children. If you just to have the most wonderful, well-behaved children there are. Cause and effect take over after that, according to the investment we have in that sense of self. I am perfectly okay just the way I was, am, and will be, to sort of be on automatic pilot, where our behavior and decision-making is looked upon as being perfectly okay and acceptable. Thus, we are using cause and effect on purpose for a happy and contented life experience. And good behavior comes up automatically because we've used the correct cause to cause good and appropriate behavior. So thanks a lot for listening to this audio.